Hello, Iceborne and Interlopers. My name is TB Sky, and as promised, we are going to be taking a full live editing session deep dive into The Eye in the Abyss. Now, it's been a while since I've done one of these, so I'll just kind of recap the format for those who haven't been around for one of these before. I'm going to read the full short story, 35 minutes, read it out loud to you as we go on through it. So this, strap yourselves in, because this is going to be a hell of a long video. And what I'm going to be doing over the course of reading the story is I'm going to be essentially kind of editing the story live. I'm going to be looking for any mistakes or any inconsistencies or anything that I feel like niggles at me or doesn't quite work for me. I'm going to be pointing out what doesn't work for me and why it doesn't work for me. However, I don't want anyone to mistake this as some sort of me going down the checklist of objectively good writing and going, aha, not good writing, check, not good writing, check, not good writing, check. There's no objectivity here. This is a perspective that I'm offering, right? And that's very much what my editing process is. I go through everything and say, okay, you could improve this by doing that, you could improve this by doing that, you could change this, you could change that. And that's not to say that everything must be changed in order for the story to be good. Like sometimes, in fact, when you get editing that is very drastic, sometimes it's better to commit more strongly to your original vision. So don't consider this kind of thing discouraging if I point out something and I say, oh, that doesn't work for me, and that's a thing that you like to do in your writing. I'm not sitting here saying that you're wrong for doing that. I'm saying that from my perspective, for the purposes of this story, something might work or might not work. Anyway, having that gotten out of the way, let's go through it. And essentially, it's just I'm going to read a bit, and then I'm going to criticize a bit, and I'm going to read a bit and criticize a bit. And the longer we go, probably the fewer criticisms I'm going to have, because I'm going to have covered, most of the major points that I want to touch on. So, the story is called The Eye in the Abyss. It's by Anthony Reynolds, and it concerns as its theme. And by the way, I'm presupposing for the purposes of this video that you have already read the story, that this is not the first time that you're reading it, because going through it with me in a video, that's a terrible way to experience the story for the first time. Go and read it for yourselves, then come back. That would be my advice. It concerns a particular ritual that Lysandra has her tribe undergo on a very regular basis, where they descend into the depths of the Howling Abyss, as well as other sites where the Watchers have been emerging, or were trying to emerge anyway, into Runeterra back during the age of the legendary heroes and wars and stuff in the way back times, checking on how much the Watchers so far have managed to melt their way through the true ice. Right, so that's the basic premise, is that we have these three characters descending into this dark, deep abyss to check on, what the Eye in the Abyss is doing, essentially. So Sigvar Halfkriver, and I'm sorry, I'm gonna be slipping in and out of my Danish accent here, I just can't help it, knelt on one knee, head bowed, while the wind beyond the gates howled like the ice wraiths of legend. He was the cleaver of peaks, the bloody sword of Winterspike. He had taken the head of the war chief of the chosen children, Helmgar Cragheart, and had held the Valley of Spines alone, fighting the Mourncrow tribe to a standstill until reinforcements from the Citadel arrived. What's more, Sigwa was Iceborne, and as a reminder, Iceborne are the people who were blessed with special cold-resisting powers and just physical power and long-livedness by the entities in the Void back when Lysandra first struck her deal with them to let them into the material realm. And yet, for all his deeds, all the honors he had earned under the eye of Lysandra, as he knelt in the open gateway of the Frostguard citadel with the wind lashing and the unearthly banshee's veil of the howling abyss whipping around him, he felt a flutter of trepidation at the task ahead. So, this whole section right here is doing a couple of things. First of all, it's establishing that the character in question here is an accomplished warrior. That's part of it, is that all this sort of in-universe, because what we have is that he was the cleaver of peaks, the bloody sword of Winterspike. He had taken the head of the chosen war chief of the chosen children, Helmgar Cragheart, and held the Valley of Spines alone, fighting the Mourncrow tribe to a standstill. We don't know what the hell any of this is. What are the Mourncrow tribe? I don't know. Helmgar Cragheart, who is he? I don't know. Chosen children? I don't know. Winterspike? Where's that bloody sword of what does that mean? He's the cleaver of peaks. What peaks? Did he slash a mountain in half? What happened? None of it really matters. None of those accomplishments are material to us as readers. They're only material for establishing the way in which Sigvar thinks of himself. This is his self-perception that I've done all of these great deeds and that makes me a hero. This is also something that works quite well, I think, with the kind of Viking aesthetic and the sort of high north Viking backstory that underlies a lot of what the Freljord is because in Viking culture, indeed, you would give yourself all these particular nicknames or take these nicknames where you could find them, and you would brag heavily about the deeds that you had done, because that was, you know, having done great deeds was the way to get into Valhalla, amongst other things. So, and yet he, for all his deeds, all the honors he had earned on the Lysandra, as he knelt in the open gate with the Frostguard citadel, with the wind lashing and the unearthly banshees wail at the howling of his whooping around him, he felt a froth of trepidation for the task ahead. He did not wear his heavy, dark armor, for his weight would have been impractical for what was to come. And here, my little nitpick here's for is kind of a formal word. He did not wear his dark, heavy armor, for its weight would have been impractical for what was to come. Which is where I would have used the word like since, or because, or as, or just he did not wear his heavy dark armor, its weight would have been impractical for what was to come. The moment you inject for into your language, at least in my mind, it starts sounding like that highfalutin, he did not wear his dark heavy armor, for its weight would have been impractical for, like, you get into that mode of speaking, at least in the voice that's inside my head. And those little choices like that, when you accidentally choose a word that sounds more archaic than you mean it to, for me, at least, that's the kind of thing that can kind of take me out of the experience and go, wait a minute, have I been reading it wrong this whole time? Am I supposed to read it in a kind of old-timey, you know, highfalutin language? And no, I'm not. I can spoil that for you. That's really not. The story kind of has a little bit of a tone problem like that. This comes across again later in the paragraph. But he felt comfort in having his shield on his back and his sword at his hip. Expectation hung upon him. He prayed he would not be found wanting. Again, the story is dipping a little bit into sort of this slightly heightened, semi-poetic language, like this sort of more Old English formal language. But the trouble is, it doesn't really keep that tone. Certain characters use it. Like we have here a priest in the next section who's going to be using like a lot of the highfalutin language because that tells you something about who he is. He's a priest. He is someone whose job and whose personality demands that he use the highfalutin language. But the rest of the story and the rest of the narrative voice, that is all the description stuff that's not dialogue, doesn't really stick to that highborn voice. And for me, that's a slight nitpick that annoys me when I read something, is because my mental voice keeps trying to shift back and forth between different intonations, and it's just a confusing thing. Anyway, expectation hung upon him. He prayed he would not be found wanting. You delve now into the darkness below, brothers and sisters of the lodge, said Rakala, split-tongued, frost father of the keepers. But you will not be alone. We, the children of the frozen shadow, are never alone. Not in the darkest winters of the frozen expanse, nor in the deepest chasm of the hidden ways. The eye of Lysandra watches over us, now and always. From ice we are born, and to ice we will return, intoned Sigvar, his words echoing, again, slipping into my Danish accent, his words. That's the trouble when you're Danish or when you're Scandinavian. Slipping between the V sound and the W sound can be really difficult. Sigvar, his words, or Sigwar, his words. Anyway, echoing those of the other two lodge members kneeling beside him. To his left was Ola Stonefist, a legend among the Frostguard, who had fought in their ranks for half a lifetime before Sigvar had even been born. Wolf, lean, grey-bearded, and iron-eyed, his skin was like hardened leather, riven with deep crevasses and valleys. Ice-bare furs draped his shoulders, but his arms were bare, covered in faded war tattoos and a dozen iron rings, each one in ritual combat. So, here's again a little bit of a nitpick. His skin was like hardened leather, riven with deep crevasses and valleys. This is poetic language that's meant to give us sort of a metaphor to understand just how old and cragged this particular warrior is. But like, his skin was like hardened leather, riven with crevasses, or, you know, just say wrinkled, or like toughened and hardened. Like, the whole riven with deep crevasses and valleys is a little bit too much, I think, to just describe the skin of a character, unless you want us, like, because it's also a question of how are we looking at this character. When you do a really close-up examination of a character's skin like that, that's kind of the language that I would expect in a romance novel, like, oh, his skin was, you know, like, you know, golden sand on some tropical beach out in the far wilderness where we could make love, blah, blah, blah. It's strange because we're seeing this from Sigvar's perspective, that he's looking at Ola Stonefist. So why is we're looking through his eyes, why is he taking notice that his skin is riven with deep crevasses and valleys? Why wouldn't he say covered in scars and old wounds? Like, why wouldn't something that's more related to the fact that he's a warrior and to the concerns with which Sigvar would be looking at him? And then we have ice bear furs. And again, like, we're gonna have lots of nitpicks early on in this video. And I say early, it's already been 10 minutes. Strap yourselves in for a long one, folks. Ice bear furs. Now, this is something I've talked about before, but you have to be mindful of the cognitive load that you're placing on your readers as they read. His massive great hammer, Thunderchild, was strapped across his back. That weapon, its head encased in true ice, was as storied as Olar himself. These details are going to be important later in the story. Like, the hammer is going to be important, the fact that it has true ice in it is going to be important, and the fact that the weapon is legendary and very important is going to be important later on in the story. This stuff is returned to, and therefore introducing the concept to us early is a way to reduce the cognitive load on the audience. When the time comes that the hammer becomes important, we have already been told, okay, the hammer is there, it's important, you should keep it in mind. The ice bear furs and the war tattoos and the dozen iron rings, each one in ritual combat, a lot of this description is telling us a lot about the physical appearance of Olar Stonefist. But here's the thing. Olar's physical appearance isn't important to the story. Not really, not particularly. And this is something that happens again. To the right, Sigvar's right knelt Hala, ice in her soul, while the Aldas, those are Sigvar's overrun, utterly feels and unforgivable. And then we get a complicated description of Hala, ice in her soul as well. She, like Sigvar, had to shoot her armor for the journey. The sides of her head were shaved, while the rest of her pale hair was tied into a single intricate braid down the center of her head, like a crest. Her left eye was white, blinded by a blow that had left a trio of savage scars across her face. Like, all of this description of the characters it's good for world building. It's good for getting us into the mindset of what kinds of people are living in this world that we're looking at. And since these three characters are going to be the main characters in the narrative, it does make a certain degree of sense to have some physical description. My nitpick here is that there's too much of it for the purposes of the story itself. I think a few short sentences, like a legend among the Frostguard who had fought in the ranks half a lifetime before Sigvar had been born, wolf-lean, grey-bearded, and iron-eyed. This would have been enough to describe Olar to us in a way that would have given us a mental image of him without trying to dictate, because all of this is costume description. His skin is like hardened leather, ice bear furs across his shoulder, bare arms, war tattoos, dozen iron rings, one in ritual combat. All of this is costume description, and the same thing goes for this. Like, describing the intricacies of her haircut is not relevant to her character, really. Like, her left eye was white, blinded by a blow that had left a trio of savage scars across her face. That sounds like an interesting detail, but the fact that she's blind in one eye is not going to come up again over the course of the... Like, it's not going to be relevant. It's not going to be a thing. So you're putting all of this... this is the author trying to dictate to you, the reader, what these characters must look like in your head. And that never works for me. Like, as a reader, that never works for me. For me, it's always kind of an annoyance that, okay, so I have to go form a specific image. Because when I think of books I have enjoyed, like, for instance, the Discworld novels, which are some of my favorite novels of all time, rarely, if ever, do character descriptions. Instead, they prefer to describe character personalities rather than describing their physical appearance, if at all possible. And the same thing goes for a book like Lord of the Rings. Really not a ton of physical description of characters like Aragorn and Legolas in there. They're defined much more by their actions, although Tolkien's narrative approach isn't necessarily comparable to the narrative approach in a story like this one. Anyway, my argument here is that all of this, like, Bloodfang and Bloodclaw, her axes, are going to be important later. They matter to the story, but all of this physical description stuff doesn't really, it doesn't come up again. It doesn't influence the story. It doesn't matter what they look like. What they look like is never going to be important to the action that's going to be happening in the story. If it was a thing of, oh, Olar, with his incredible physically intimidating appearance, manages to gain some kind of advantage over some other tribe that was threatening them or something like that, he manages to intimidate someone by virtue of his looks, then it makes sense to give us a physical description. But since it's never going to come up again, Anyway, that was a massive bit of a sideways thing. To Sigvar's right knelt Hala Eisenhersoul. While he idolized Olar, Sigvar was overawed by Hala. Utterly fearless and her faith unshakable, she was as unforgiving as and deadly as winter. Again, this right here I think would have been enough character description for her. Her twin short-hafted axes, and again, short-hafted, do we need to know how long the shaft is on the axis? Bloodfang and Bloodclaw hung at her waist, though it was strange to see her not garbed in her dark mail and horned helm. She, like Sigvar and Olaf, have eschewed her armor for their journey. And again, we already know that they've taken off their armor because it's impractical for the journey, so I don't know why you're bringing it up multiple times. The sides of her head were shaved, while the rest of her pale hair was tied into a single intricate braid down the center of her head like a crest. Her left eye was white, blinded by a blow that had left a trio of savage scars cut across her face. He'd heard Olar tell the tale of those scars, earned when Hala had fought a hunting pack of Ursine. She'd killed 3 before the others slunk off, so it was said, and Sigvar believed it. Had she not been embraced into the Frostguard as a child, Hala would have undoubtedly been a powerful war mother in one of the tribes beyond the Citadel. Again, this is not gonna come up again. It's not really gonna be important. So it does do something to establish why Sigvar has so much respect for her. So it's not like it's completely superfluous. It's just, yeah, I feel like you could cut it away and the story wouldn't really lose anything. The Frost Priest stepped in close, moving first to Ola. "The eye is upon you," he incanted. Sigvar barely heard Olar's growled reply. His heart was thumping so hard. Then the Frost Priest was in front of him, and his stomach lurched as it had before his first battle. "Look up, Frostguard," the priest said quietly, and Sigvar obeyed, tilting his chin back to look upon the old man's face. It was skeletally gaunt, with sunken cheeks and shadow-rimmed eyes. There was no kindness there, but Sigvar expected none. Theirs was a harsh and unrelenting faith. A shard of sacred dark eyes hung around Split Tongue's neck. Another topped his knotted staff, slivers of holy reverence used for healing and worship. The Frost Priest dipped a finger into a shallow basin filled with kraken ink, black and stinking, and drew an eye upon Sigvar's forehead. "The eye is upon you," he said, "and it does not blink," intoned Sigvar in reply, lowering his head once more. His forehead burned as the ink seared into his skin, but he endured it with the stoicism of the Iceborn. Pain was blessing. Yeah, I thought I had something to say, but honestly, I've kind of already covered it. The priest moved to Hala, completing the ritual, and the 3 chosen Iceborn stood. Olar was the tallest of them, wiry and corded with lean muscle, more physical description, while Sigvar was by far the heaviest. Hala stood half a head shorter than Sigvar, yet the power and authority she radiated made her seem larger. Again, there's some merit to describing the fact that Hala has an aura of power and confidence about her, but couching that in even more physical description, I would rather have it just be like Hala just takes charge of them and commands them, which indeed she does later on down the story. She takes command, and so she gains an air of confidence with us, the reader, without it being necessary that you spell it out literally. The three Frostguards stooped to collect their packs, ice picks, and coils of rope, which they threw over their shoulders and hooked onto their belts. Sigvar glanced back at the ranks of Frostguards standing in silent witness to their departure. Rakala Split Tongue turned away, his part in their expedition done. A cluster of other Frost Priests followed behind him, like crows shadowing a war party. The darkness of the Citadel quickly swallowed them. "Time to go," said Hala, ice in her soul. "The darkness calls." With a nod, Sigvar joined Hala and Olar, turning away from the gathered Frostguard and walking through the giant gates of the Citadel, out onto the bridge beyond, spanning the howling abyss. The ethereal wails borne upon the wind intensified and shards of ice slashed at them, but none of them flinched from it. They welcomed it. The ice was their ally. The ice was their truth. Behind the 3 Frostguard, the gates of the great Citadel slammed shut with a resounding boom that was soon lost in the gale. Sigvar took a deep breath. It was time to descend into the abyss. The journey was made every year, on the vernal equinox when day and night were of equal length. 3 among the Frostguard were chosen. All came from the Keeper's Lodge, the inner circle of the faith who guarded the Deeping Ways. It was a great honor to be singled out for this most sacred of duties, and Sigvar's chest had swelled with pride when the deep horns had sounded and his name had been called. Again, here's where, I want to bring up cognitive load. We're describing the Keeper's Lodge, the Inner Circle of Fate, who guard the Deeping Ways, whatever the hell they are. We're talking about, like, specifically the ritual of the vernal equinox, and deep horns, and a number of other specific terminology gets brought up as a way to world build the world. And this is not in itself necessarily a bad thing, but again, as a writer myself, and when I do editing, the thing I'm always going to ask you to keep in mind is how much of this is going to come up again. How much of this is going to be relevant again? the religious business is going to be relevant. Like, the religious business, the faith, and sort of the unflinching brutality with which they cling to their faith is going to be important later on in the story, but all of this backstory is like, this is more about world building for the world of League of Legends, and I'm a little conflicted on it, because on the one hand, yeah, that's kind of the point of writing these stories, is to world build the world of League of Legends, but I would rather it just focused on telling its own good story and world build that way, because all of this, it was a great honor to be singled out for this most sacred of duties. Sigvar shares to swell with pride when the D points that sound in his name had been called. At 19 winters, he was one of the youngest Frostguard ever to have been chosen. How many times had he gazed upon that roll of honor, thousands upon thousands of names chiseled into the walls of the lodge? One of his first memories after coming to the Citadel was of reverently tracing the outline of those names and dreaming of their great deeds. More than half had a simple rune engraved after their name, the rune of death, indicating those who had perished while performing this sacred duty. It was a dangerous thing to delve too deep, even for one of the Iceborn bloodline. Kneeling before the three dark ice statues of the three revered Avarosa, Sildar, and Lysandra, he had long beseeched them to find him worthy to one day let his name join these esteemed others. Now it seemed his prayers had been answered. He had trained his whole life for this honor. He would do the Keeper's Lodge proud. The thing about all of this is that we kind of know that already. Like, that this whole thing of being chosen for this specific ritual is a big deal, that it is rare, that it is a great honor, that it is something that the Frostguard and the people who are in it long for, because that was sort of the point of this whole ritual business of like having all of the Frostguard there to witness them departing for this great honor, and having the priests speaking the ritual words and painting the eye of Lysandra on their foreheads, and all this pomp and circumstance was meant to bring home to us that this is an important ritual that matters a great deal to the culture of the Frostguard. And then, just in case we don't get it, all of this is just kind of so much fluff that's kind of injected to make sure, absolutely sure, we understand what the story is. And that's... It does make sense from a characterization standpoint that we need to know how desperate Sigvar and how dedicated Sigvar is to proving himself worthy in this task. That is an important part of characterization for him, but it seems like so much wasted space, honestly. That could have been spent on better things. Anyway, it had many names, this bridge, the Proving Grounds and the Murder Bridge among them. Haha, references. Others knew it simply as Citadel Bridge or the Howling Arch. If it had a name during the time of the Three, it was now lost. Among the Frostguard, it was often referred to as the Bridge of Sorrows. Thousands of Iceborn had perished here, after all. It was truly ancient, said to have been crafted by the old gods. The time of those deities was long past, of course. Some heathen tribes still worshipped them, but in time they would be brought around to the true faith, voluntarily or by the sword. And again, this bit here doesn't really matter. This is not what the story isn't about the heathen tribes. It's not about worshipping the old gods. All you really need to do is, it was truly ancient, said to have been crafted by the old gods. This whole thing, yeah, it doesn't really matter. And that's sort of the thing for me, is when I read a story, fluff annoys me. Like when there's something there that's kind of just patently there to do world building, but which doesn't really have any bearing on the narrative at hand, that takes me out of a story. Now, I know I'm being extremely critical of this thing, and we've been going for almost 25 minutes already. This is not to say that this is a bad story. In fact, this is one of the best stories that Riot has published in a very long time, and I really, really like it, which is why I decided to go to all the effort of being so harsh on it. Parts of the stonework had crumbled, falling into the darkness. Time had no respect for ancient beauty, the Frost Priest taught. Everything was fleeting, or on a large enough timescale. Even the greatest mountain would be leveled by wind and ice given enough years. Only faith was eternal. A deep sense of reverence hung over Sigvar as he walked with Stonefist and ice in her soul across the expanse. The greatest battle ever to have been fought had taken place here, thousands of years past. Here the Iceborn had fought the Watchers in a battle that would determine the fate of the world, and here they were victorious, though only at great cost, and the Watchers had been hurled into the darkness. Sigvar walked in silence, lost in his thoughts of that earlier, greater age. Neither of the other two Iceborn spoke as they make their way across, though whether that was due to the relentless roaring of the wind, or if they too were lost in the ancient legend, Sigvar knew not. They reached the other side of the Bridge of Sorrows, where Lysandra had led the Iceborn in that ancient titanic battle, and there Hala, ice in her soul, called a halt with a raised hand. "We go down here," she said, shouting to be heard over the gale, pointing towards... "We go down here," she said, shouting. "We go down here," she shouted to be heard. Anyway, that's a minor nitpick. Pointing towards a section of the bridge near the chasm wall that had long ago fallen. Sigvar and Ola both nodded in deference. Ola might have been older and more experienced, his name carved 9 times upon the wall of the lodge to Hala's 3, but old habits died hard. The blood of the 3 was stronger in the women of the Freljord tribes. A little bit of a world-building detail might be superfluous, but you can keep it. "I'll lead the way," shouted Hala. "Stonefist is the anchor in the center. Half quiver at the back." They unraveled 2 lengths of rope, hooking them onto each other's belts. Hala's to Ola, Ola's to Sigvar's. They tightened the straps on the iron toe spikes affixed to their boots and unhooked ice picks, securing them to their wrists with loops of leather. Hala whipped her picks around in a few arcing tight circles, loosening her muscles. Then she jumped off the bridge, landing 10 feet below on an outcropping of ice jutting from the chasm wall. Sigvar and Ola waited for her to secure herself, digging her picks into the ice before they jumped down to join her. Jumped down, join her. Missing a 2 there. "We are the will of the goddess, she who walks among us," said Hala. "Do her proud, sons of winter." Then she went over the edge, putting her picks deep and scrambling over the precipice. She kicked her toe spikes in and began the descent. Ola grinned at Sigvar, his eyes glinting with savage glee. "You will not be the same Iceborn when we return. The howling abyss changes you. If you return." He gave a wink, then he too went over the edge, disappearing from sight, leaving Sigvar alone. No, not alone, he reminded himself. The eye was upon him. He felt it, burning still into the skin of his forehead. Lysandra was with him, now and always. He waited a moment longer, then began the long climb into the fathomless depths. They moved fast, Hala, ice in her soul, setting a punishing pace, though they did not take any undue risk. They climbed one at a time, first Hala, then Ola, then Sigvar, moving almost to the lengths of their ropes with each descent. In this way, they were able to keep a steady anchor in case of a fall, and the intermittent rest allowed them to keep progressing downward steadily, without the need for a longer pause. The Bridge of Sorrows was not the only one of its kind to cross the expanse. Dozens of others spanned the walls of the crevasse, though only a few were visible at any one time. The distance, fog, and darkness closing in like a shroud. All but the uppermost bridge had long been abandoned and remain unused, in the myriad tunnels and gateways leading onto them having been sealed by Avalanche or by the Frostguard themselves to limit the number of entrances into the Citadel. The closest bridges were several hundred feet apart, yet the deeper they went, the more spaced out they became. Some had been destroyed completely, only the skeletal abutments protruding from the ice walls indicating where they had once been. It was dark, but not the complete all-consuming darkness of midwinter. It was more akin to the faded half-light of the gloaming hours. The ice itself seemed to radiate a dull, ethereal glow, which reflected upon the thickening fog, such that the 3 did not need to carry torch or brand. The shrieking gale still whipped through the ravine, tugging at them like spectral hands, trying to prise them from their tenuous hold on the ice. It was impossible to judge the passing of time. The hours blurred together into one single uninterrupted span. Climb, wait, climb, wait. On the climbs, Sigvar found a good rhythm, losing himself in the repetitive motion of hacking the ice picks in deep, kicking in the toe spikes and hauling the picks back out. While waiting for Hala and Ola to descend below him, he mouthed the litanies of truth, keeping himself focused. Resist not cold's embrace, for within it lies truth. Be as one with the ice, and understanding shall follow. Down and down and down they climbed, moving steadily. And by the way, I really like this. Down and down and down. That's a good way to establish kind of the repetitive, monotonous rhythm of the action, is by just using repetition in that way, especially in 3s or 5s. 7s is perhaps a little bit much. Hours might have passed, or a day. Unable to see the sky, Sigvar had no way to know. Endure without complaint. The ice begs not for mercy, nor offers it. Neither shall we. No lesser being would have been able to match their pace. They were iceborn, the children of the gods, and they were not as other mortals. Able to march for days on end without sleep and still fight any foe to a standstill, they stoically endured that which would have killed any hearthbound. This section is superfluous. It doesn't really matter. It's just world building once again. And it's a weird kind of bragging that doesn't seem to be to anybody. It would be like this kind of thing would be good if Sigvar was kind of telling himself this. If it was like he was, because what's going to be happening next is he's going to get tired and he's going to fall. So if the story had used this as kind of his internal dialogue to himself, reminding him of his legacy, reminding him of his ancestry, of the people who came before him, and yes, I'm Iceborn, I can handle this, I can do it, kind of pumping himself up, that would have mattered, that would have worked perhaps, but as it is, this whole thing is just pointless world building that doesn't really do anything. Even so, Sigvar's forearms were aching, and he was covered in a sheen of sweat beneath his skin and furs, and when the ice gave way beneath him, he was too slow to react. He struck out with one of his ice picks, but it did not bite deeply, and merely tore a chunk from the wall, and then he was falling. Fear not pain, nor seek to avoid its blessing. Without it, there can be no life. Turning in the air, he made another attempt to arrest his fall, slamming an ice pick into the ice, but it tore from his grasp, and he would have lost it had it not been tethered to his wrist. And when death comes, flinch not from its approach. He dropped 40 feet, hurtling past Olar. The older man's flinty eyes were wide. From ice we are born, and to ice we return. Brace! The old Frostguard warrior bellowed, tightening his grip and bending his legs with anticipation. He saw Hala look up and mouth a curse as she realized he was falling straight towards her. She moved quickly and assuredly, hacking her pick swiftly into the ice and shifting herself sideways so he didn't smash her from the cliffside. The rope caught his fall then, arresting it with bone-jawing abruptness. He slammed into the ice wall, the impact driving the air from his lungs. Ola roared as he took Sigvar's weight. Stonefist held, however, clinging to the ice, his arms taut as iron. Sigvar recovered quickly, slamming his picks home and kicking his toe spikes in deep. He glanced over at Hala Eisenhersoul, who stared at him, her own piercing eyes, one blue, one white. Why do you remind us of this? As unblinking as the one painted on her forehead. She stared in silent judgment. "We'll take a rest at the Bridge of Shadow," she said, finally, and continued climbing down into the twilight gloom. Sigvar cursed himself, his cheeks burning, despite the cold. When Ola climbed down past him, he gave another of his wide, toothy grins. "You're a heavy bastard, half-quiver," he said. "Damn well nearly took us both down with you." "The ice gave way," said Sigvar weakly. "I'll do better." "Say that you do. Might just cut your rope next time." Sigvar looked at the old warrior quizzically. On 3 of his previous expeditions down into the abyss, Olar had been the only one to return alive. Was this why? At the Bridge of Shadow, they dropped their packs, uncoupled their ropes, and unhooked their ice picks. The bridge was so named because, even in midsummer, when the sun never dipped below the horizon, it was never truly in the light. Olar slumped to the flagstones with an exaggerated groan, propping his back against the low balustrade on the edge of the bridge. Hala stepped away from the other two, unhooking a tiny black effigy of Lysandra from around her neck and placing it upon the ground. She knelt before it, breathing a devotion. Sigvar stood stock still, wondering if he too should take this time to pray, but Ola waved him over, urging him to sit. The older man, exactly how old he didn't know, but Ola was certainly well past 60, produced a small leather flask. Unstoppering it, he took a swig, a little typo there as well, gave a satisfied sigh and handed it to Sigvar. The younger warrior took it with a nod of thanks and knocked back a measure. "Tears of the gods," said Olar. "Nothing like it this side of the Ridgeback Mountains." The liquid burned hot in his throat, making his eyes water. Those tears turned instantly to ice on his cheeks. He nodded in appreciation and handed it back to Olar, who took another swig before secreting it back within his furs. A waterskin would have frozen as soon as they stepped beyond the gates of the citadel. They would endure without, but the strong spirit was welcome moisture on Sigvar's throat. Olar's heavily tattooed arms were still bare, and Sigvar shook his head as he pulled his furs tighter around him. "Aren't you freezing, old man?" he said. "It's going to get a lot colder than this, boy," said Olar, giving him an evil grin. "This is like a summer's breeze compared to what's yet to come." Sigvar didn't know if he was joking. He pulled his pack over to the side and brought out a small strip of salted meat, wrapped in waxed leather. He snapped off a frozen section and handed it to Olar before breaking off a piece for himself. He worked it around his mouth, thawing it enough to chew. It was tough and sinewy, but at that moment it seemed an extravagant luxury. Slumped with his back against the low wall alongside Olar, Sigvar was out of the worst of the howling wind, which itself was a blessing. It screamed over them, wailing horribly, sending flurries of ice and snow swirling across the bridge. Some said the sound of the wind was the screams of the thousands of Iceborn killed in that final titanic battle in the Age of Heroes long ago, their souls trapped forever here in this chasm. "It's a fearful sound, isn't it, lad?" said Olar. "Gets inside your head after a time." "Is it the same all the way down?" Olar shook his head. "What that it was. No, down towards the bottom, it's as silent as the grave." That's got to be better than this. You'd think so, wouldn't you? But the silence is worse. It's heavy, that silence. Weighs upon you like full-length chainmail. No, I'd take this any day. Weighs upon you like full-length chainmail. That choice of words is supposed to communicate the fact that Olar is a warrior, and so his terminology and his vocabulary is focused on battle stuff. But weighs upon you like armor, or weighs upon you like chainmail would have been fine. Full length is like, no, it doesn't just weigh upon you like chainmail. It weighs upon you like full length chainmail. Oh yes, it's nitpick, but it's still a thing. Hala finished her devotions and joined them, sitting alongside Olar. She took a swig from Olar's flask, then wiped her mouth with the back of her gloved hand. How is it you always have the best stuff, Stonefist? She said, making Olar snort. Must be my charming personality, he replied. I'm quite certain that's not it. Her expression was deadpan, making Olar snort once more. Sigvar leaned over, gingerly offering her some meat, still hot with shame at having fallen. She looked at it for half a moment, making Sigvar think she was going to reject the offer, but finally she took it and nodded her thanks. How did you earn your name, Half-Quiver? She asked as she chewed. There was a raid. I was a tenderfoot accompanying a caravan escort bringing provisions back to the Citadel. We were attacked out in the frozen expanse. A blizzard had hidden their approach. Tuskcrow tribe. That seems like an unnecessary detail to add, but anyway, he's telling a story, so it doesn't matter. Hala grunted. Dangerous warriors. Head takers. Sigvar nodded. I took some arrows in the skirmish, kept fighting though. Stonefist honored me with my name once the last of the Tusk Crows had fled, leaving their dead and dying to the ice. That one is unnecessary as well. You'll never make a saga tell a boy, said Olar. Too modest by half. No sense for the dramatic. Not like you, old one, said Hala. I swear your stories get more far-fetched with every telling. Have I told you my bear story, lad? Olar asked, giving Sigvar a wink. No, said Hala, leveling a finger at the old Frostguard. I will not hear that again. Another time, then, said Olar, with a resigned shrug. Anyway, the Tusk Crow struck the boy with no less than a dozen arrows. You were only, 14 winters? He was a big lad, though, even then. Not quite the giant slab he is now, but still big. Had 4 arrows in his shield, 2 in his leg, 1 clean through his forearm, 2 in his chest, 1 in his shoulder, more in his back, but he kept on fighting, bellowing like a stuck elnuk. Took down 3 Tusk Crows before another arrow hit him, making him drop his sword. Still didn't slow him. He pulls out one of the arrows and kills another 2 Tusk Crows with it. One of the funniest damn things I ever saw. True Iceborn. Would have done Cyrilda herself proud. Fail his mother, said Hala instantly, grasping the pale talisman of Cyrilda hanging along her neck alongside those of Abarosa and Lysandra. Fearless mother, Sigvar murmured. His face was burning and he looked down, uncomfortable with Olar's praise. You have a strange sense of what is funny, Stonefist, said Hala, pushing herself back to her feet. Come, it is time to move on. I'm sorry I fell, Sigvar said, as he regained his feet and made ready for the next stage of the climb. On my oath, I will not let either of you down again. If you fall, it is the will of the 3, said Hala, and if you fall and take us down with you, then such is to be our fate also. Your oath matters nothing. She walked past him, looking for the best place to recommence their descent. Olar grinned and slapped a heavy hand on Sigvar's shoulder. It's fine, lad. Happens to the best of us. If that's the worst we go through, we'll all be on our knees thanking the 3. Down into the deep they continued, chased, as always, by the howls and the biting wind. And here's where I'm going to need some water, because, hoo boy, this is definitely going to go very long. So, let's talk about why I haven't stopped a lot to criticize this particular chapter. That's because it's really very good and I don't really have a lot to criticize. Or chapter, I say. It's more of a segment. It does a lot of things very well. It does a really good job of building a dynamic, a rapport between the 3 characters. It tells us a lot about who Olar is as a character, that he's this kind of rascally, sort of irreverent warrior type who doesn't really who cares about having a drink and just having some fun and taking pleasure in life, while Hala is the much more hard-bitten, much more sort of religiously minded person who's not really at all interested in making jokes or having a lot of small talk, but who nonetheless gets pulled in by Olar's bragging. And we also get more insight into Sigvar himself, that he is a young man, like in the literal sense of the word. He's a young man. He's not comfortable with bragging about himself. He's not really sure of his own worth. He's not sure if he's worthy of that praise. He's not sure if he's worthy to do the bragging yet. And you know, all of it is just, it's just honestly really quite good. It does a good job of giving us a character dynamic to key into, some characters to care about, so that you know, we're invested in what happens to them because we want to know, okay, what is Olar's bear story? Which Hala has like, no, fucking hell, no, I don't want to hear that damn story again. What is that story? That sounds like an interesting story. That might be fun to hear. So you have some investment in what's going to happen to the characters. Are they all going to make it out alive? What's going to be happening next? And, you know, if Riot wanted to maybe do some more stories about them, wouldn't that be an interesting thing to read? And that's going to be important later. More water. Oh, good lord. Apologies if I burp on accident. Anyway, let's continue where we left off. It appeared like a wraith out of the fog. One moment there was nothing below them, then it was there. The Bridge of the Lost. From a distance, it looked almost as though it had been overrun by some voracious black weed or thorn bush. The notion was absurd, of course, for no life could flourish at this depth. Again, for instead of since or because. Such was the cold that almost seemed to radiate up from below. No, this growth was nothing as mundane as plant life. It was the very antithesis of life. A knot of unease had settled in Sigvar's gut, and he swallowed, feeling his gorge rising. He had heard the legends and the fireside stories from lodge members who had made this descent, but even so, it was unnerving. He dropped the final 10 feet, landing in a low crouch. His muscles burned with exertion, and his hands were twisted like claws from gripping his picks. Nevertheless, for all his exhaustion, he stared around him, barely daring to breathe, eyes wide. Touch nothing, Hala warned him. If I do touch something, it's the will of the three, is it not? Said Olar. Sigvar didn't have it in him to smile at the old warrior's jibe. Hala turned away, shaking her head. Catch your breath. This is the last bridge. There's no more stopping before we reach the bottom, and the next stretch is the longest. May the three watch over us. Having dropped his excess load, Sigvar walked onto the center of the bridge, gazing around him in horrified wonder. The wind was not as fierce here, hissing through the strange stony formations that grew like a twisting lattice around the structure of the bridge. He found it hard to fathom what he saw, though just gazing upon it made him feel sick. Giant arcs of what looked like volcanic rock encased the bridge, as if bursts of lava had leapt along and around the length of the bridge before hardening suddenly in midair. He knew the history of this bridge, of course, that which was trapped below had tried to escape its imprisonment long ago, long after the time of the three. Here, Frostguard had fought that darkness, and here they had died. And with each death, the power of what dwells below grew. It consumed the bodies of the fallen, absorbing and repurposing them to fuel more explosive growth. Such was its nature. It might lie dormant for thousands of years, inert and seemingly lifeless, only for a single drop of blood to rouse it in sudden, shocking violence. What Sigvar was looking at, and this bit here, this is more like world building for what the Void does once it enters the physical realm. It's sort of relevant to the story, but again, it's the kind of thing where I think you could have cut it away, and it really wouldn't do much to decrease the understanding of the story. What Sigvar was looking at, those strange, nausea-inducing looping arcs and conglomerations of misshapen detritus, were the growth paths of what dwells below, as it had leapt from Frostguard to Frostguard, claiming them. And from the matter it consumed, things had been born. There was an uncomfortable, maddening pressure on Sigvar's mind here, a pressure that seemed to be coming from below. He pressed his knuckles into his temples, trying to relieve it. From nowhere, a memory long forgotten came back to him in a rush, like a swarm of bats bursting from a cave. That's an unusual simile. He remembered his childhood before he'd been taken by the Frostguard. He remembered the ice arcs of his tribe, sleek three-masted ships that raced across the frozen wastes upon sharpened keel blades. He remembered the night their ships had slid to a halt at the great pinnacle. Black-helmed warriors of the Frostguard awaited them there. Sigvar and 6 other children under the age of 10 winters were chosen from among the tribe. It was a great honor. And there, under the midnight sun, he watched his tribe sail away. It was the last time he saw his family. He was taken to the citadel where he underwent the trials and was subjected to the grueling, brutal testing. One by one, the other children of his original tribe dwindled, and he was the only one that remained. By then, he had all but forgotten his tribe. He had a new family, a new faith. He was Frostguard. A hand on his shoulder brought him, shuddering, back to the present. He was sitting with his back against the splintered stone statue of an ancient guardian. He had no memory of sitting down. Olar was stooped over him. "Don't sleep," said the old warrior. "Bad dreams down here. Bad memories." Okay, so this, again, is a little bit of character building for a couple of things. It's a character building for Sigvar. It tells us something about the culture of the Frostguard, how they recruit their members, how people become, members of the Frostguard, how they are brought into this religion through a process of being isolated from their family. and then losing most of their previous social network, as it were. Now, the thing about that is some of the, like, this is somewhat relevant to the story as it progresses. It tells us something about what the Watchers that lie in the depths can do, that they can affect the minds of people, and they particularly are affecting the minds of young Sigvar because he's not really experienced in resisting this kind of thing. But it's also kind of a long section whose only function is to tell us something about the Frostguard that only tangentially really relates to the characterization of the other characters. It's like, I would have cut this down substantially to just maybe focus on some of the memories from the testing, from watching his family slip away. In fact, I might have fragmented it into these sort of fragments of memory that are kind of racing across his mind, building a picture out of pixels, as it were, instead of going into this like full-length description of stuff. But anyway, that's minor nitpick. Sigvar climbed to his feet. He hadn't thought about his old tribe for years. The lingering fragments of the dream slipped away, leaving Sigvar with a heavy, deep sense of unease. "It is time," said Hala. And so they began their final descent. There was nothing below them now but madness and cold and darkness and dread. Madness and cold and darkness and dread. That has a really good rhythm to it. When you want to do a phrase like that, you should check it for its rhythm. Like, you should try and say it out loud. Madness and cold and darkness and dread has, I think it's an iambic pentameter, actually, because you have a stressed and an unstressed syllable following each other in sequence. Anyway, but if you have a good rhythm, you can get away with making sentences like this: madness and cold and darkness and dread, right? Normally you would list that. You would be madness, cold, darkness, and dread. But having the "and" there provides a particular rhythm to how it's said out loud, and indeed how it's read in your head. Madness and cold and darkness and dread, right? Good ring to it. The more you can implement that kind of thing into your writing, at least in my experience, the easier it flows across the brain of the reader, or at least the easier it flows across my brain, the more familiar it feels, sort of the more entertaining it is to read. Anyway, what dwells below waited, just as it had for millennia. The ice darkened the further down they went. Black veins spread through it, clawing upwards. A vague, crackling sound surrounded them, seeming to scratch at the back of Sigvar's eyes. He could see no movement, but he imagined it came from those unnerving threads in the ice, seeking to escape this accursed pit and reach for the surface. Sigvar tried to push the sound from his head, invoking the litanies under his breath and focusing on each kick of his toe spikes, each strike of his picks. The ice was even less here, with jutting sections and savage undercut overhangs to traverse. At times, the three Frostguard were forced to continue using only their picks, legs dangling precariously above the endless depths as they worked their way ever downwards. Twice their progress was blocked with no conceivable way down, and they were forced to backtrack until Hala determined a new route. Icy fog closed in tightly around them, heavy and oppressive, such that Sigvar could no longer see his companions below. The fog muffled all sound, barred that incessant, maddening scratching. At the last, a floor of solid ice emerged, surprising Sigvar with its abrupt appearance through the fog. Hala and Ola waited for him, having already unburdened themselves of their packs, ropes, and picks. The silence here was overbearing. Even the crackling in the ice seems to have stopped. "We're at the base," whispered Sigvar, his breath fogging the air as he shrugged off his gear. "This is as far as we go," said Olar in a low voice. "But it delves deeper still." The older Frostguard ushered him forward, pointing. They stood close to a precipice, and Sigvar saw the chasm dropped away below them, ever deeper. "How far?" he whispered. "No one knows. To the center of the world and beyond. Perhaps to the realm of what dwells below." Sigvar tapped one toe spike onto the ice underfoot. "We could very easily have missed this. We'd come down 30 feet that way, and we'd be climbing down forever." "Ice in our soul would not have steered us wrong," said Olar, putting a hand on Sigvar's back, guiding him to Hala. Sigvar knelt, placing one gloved hand near the ice. The cold was intense, causing him pain even through his thick layers. More than just cold, though, the ice radiated power. This is all true ice?" he whispered, his eyes alight with reverence and awe. "It is," said Hala. "Only the chosen few has seen it. That eye is truly upon you, Half-Quiver, upon all of us. We are blessed." True Ice was part of the Frostguard faith, revered as a holy gift from the three. Infused with ancient elemental power, it was harder than iron and would never melt, even in the hottest forge. To carry a weapon that bore even a portion of true ice, like the Warhammer Thunderchild borne by Olar and Hela's twin axes Bloodfang and Bloodclaw, was an honor of deeply religious significance. The skill to craft such weapons was long lost. Those remaining were sacred relics carried by iceborne heroes of long ago. Sigvar prayed he would one day be found worthy to bear such a venerable relic, but for now his trusty hand-and-a-half sword, forged in a land far beyond the frozen wastes, would do. It was a fine weapon by any measure, and had never let him down. So a couple of things. This right here is a reminder. In the technical sense, it's a setup, reminder, and payoff is a common structure to use in storytelling. It's particularly common when it comes to movies and film scripting, is when you have a thing that's going to be important to the story, you're going to do a setup where you mention it for the first time. You establish that this thing is a part of the story and the audience should keep it in mind. Then later on in the story, you're going to do a reminder. You're going to remind the audience, hey, this thing we set up in the beginning, still important, still keep an eye out for it. And then near the end, you pay it off in some way. And that's what this whole thing is. That Sigvar has a desire to be found worthy of bearing one of these iceborne weapons, and we need to be reminded that the iceborne weapons that are at play in this story, or the true ice weapons that are at play in this story, are Thunderchild borne by Olar and Hala's twin axes Bloodfang and Bloodclaw. Now, I think mentioning the names of the weapons again is perhaps going a little bit overboard, but this is a reminder that's probably quite timely, because it's been a long time since the introduction, and it's going to be a while yet until these become truly relevant. So just keeping it in the forefront of the audience's mind is not at all a bad idea. This whole thing about his trusty half-and-a-hand sword forged in the land far away beyond the frozen wastes, it was a fine weapon by any measure, that's a little bit superfluous, and you can kind of cut that without losing anything. We are close. The three be praised, Hala said. We move. And by the way, I love that Hala is so sparse with her words. Like, that's the mark of someone who's good at writing characters, is that they can give the characters a vocabulary, a speaking style in their head and stick to it, that they don't accidentally, you know, start changing how the character speaks over the course of the story as the scene demands that they change their attitude in order to be funnier or more interesting, more engaging. Hala is short with her words. She doesn't talk too much, and that is pretty consistent throughout the whole story, and I quite like that. Olar, by the way, is someone who is fond of using way too many words, and Sigvar tends to speak in a little bit too much of a formal way. He speaks like an insecure young man, essentially. They loped along the ravine, running as a pack with Hala leading the way. The temperature here was unlike anything Sigvar had ever experienced, though he had lived his whole life in the barren, frozen wastes. Despite his layers of skins and furs, it chilled him to the bone, and every breath was painful. His exposed face was quickly encased in a thin layer of ice which cracked every time Sigvar blinked. Olar's beard was frozen, such that it could have snapped where it struck. Frost crackled up their boots as the ice underfoot tried to claim them, making every step an effort. Only an iceborne could survive this. Even so, Sigvar wasn't sure how long he would last down here. An hour? Perhaps 2? Certainly no more than that. Hala kept them moving. To stop was to die. They came, finally, to a section where the chasm narrowed, so that they could only proceed one by one through the gap. Hala went first, and Olar indicated that Sigvar should go next. Do not let your gaze linger on it, warned Olar. It is not a good thing to look on. What do you mean, said Sigvar. Olar merely shook his head and would say no more. Sigvar pushed himself into the crevice, wondering what it was the old warrior meant. The gap was narrow, and he was considerably larger than Hala. The true ice seared him as he squeezed through, pressing in on all sides. He was so cold that he was sure one hammer blow would shatter his bones, but he continued on, edging forward inch by inch until he was through. A large, bowl-like cavern awaited him on the other side. The ice underfoot he was clearer, shifting from opaque towards transparent. In the middle of the cavern it was perfectly smooth, like a black mirror. The floor at the center was a broad expanse, surrounded by massive jutting shards of true ice. They looked like pillars, arranged in a rough circle around the open middle, giving the cavern the feel of some sacred circle of lost gods. There were 9 of those icy pillars, and it took Sigvar a moment to realize the significance of that number. The Hall of the 9, he said in reverence. He had learned of the 9, of course. They were akin to great shackles holding what dwells below, and were said to have been created by magic long lost. Some said that it was the Yetis who created the 9, but Sigvar had long grown out of such childish tales. A bit of a reference to Nunu's lore there. Even so, he knew they had arrived at their destination. We stay to the edges outside the circle, said Hala, once Olar had slipped through the narrow defile to join them. Go nowhere near the center of the ice, and do not look down. Sigvar knew she was speaking for his benefit, and he nodded. Each of the 9 must be checked. I will start here and go that way, said Hala, indicating the closest pillar and motioning past it around to the right. Stonefist, you start there and go that way. Take the boy with you. At any other time, Sigvar would have bristled to have been called boy and have someone tasked to watch over him. He'd faced charging troll berserkers in the deepest winter and felt nothing but savage joy, but right now he was grateful to remain at Olar's side. A palpable tension hung in the air, like the threat felt in the moments between a lightning flash and the thunder's crash. That's a good way to phrase that. They walked towards the nearest pillars, Sigvar making a conscious effort to keep his gaze high. Once, perhaps, this had been an enclosed cave, but the roof had long ago collapsed. Sigvar had the impression that the collapse had been caused by something vast having been hurled down from above. He dared not look down, but even so he could see the dark shadow beneath the ice at the periphery of his vision. It tugged at him, as if straining for his attention. Don't look, Olar hissed, perhaps feeling that pressure himself. Hala reached the first ice shard and began a slow circle around it, peering intently. Olar and Sigvar approached the second. What do we look for? Said Sigvar in a low voice, struggling to keep his gaze from wandering towards the center of the ice. Anything that has changed, replied Olar. Up close, Sigvar could see threads of frozen darkness trapped within the true ice. How do we know if anything has changed? He murmured. Olar didn't answer at first. His eyes narrowed as he surveyed the sharply angled sides of the towering ice shard. Finally, he gave a grunt and pointed. Runes were carved in this ice long ago, when what dwells below was first banished. See here? Sigvar stepped in closer and saw a small series of lines carved into the surface, forming a runic script. What does it mean? He asked. It means the ice had not melted. Come, let's check the next one. They set out, hugging the left wall of the cave, continuing to skirt the open expanse in the center. Sigvar would never be clearly able to articulate what happened next. He remembered following Olar, staying close as they moved towards the next pillar. He remembered a heavy pressure building in his skull, and the sensation of movement in the corner of his eyes. The silence weighed upon him, oppressive and heavy, and everything seemed to become unclear, as if he were surrounded in a sudden fog, muffling every sense. Then he was standing out in the center of the ice, gazing downwards. An immense eye stared back at him, unblinking. Sigvar's soul recoiled, screaming inwardly, yet he was unable to look away, completely enthralled to that giant, staring, lidless eye. Perhaps 20 feet of solid ice separated him from this shadowy behemoth, but it was not nearly enough. It was impossible to see clearly, but Sigvar was left with an impression of a shadowy, coiling tentacle limbs that surrounded the great eye. It would have dwarfed even the largest of the titanic leviathans that swam the fathomless depths beneath the ice floes. A creature of such size should not be. This is perhaps an unnecessary thing. You could remove this and just have that, and you would still have the horror of the thing that he's staring at. And it was not dead. There was life and a vast, unknowable intelligence in that stare. It saw him. Its gaze bored into him, through him, and he felt his sanity begin to unravel like a spool of yarn hurled into the night. Sigvar's stomach was an ever-tightening knot, dark shadows coiling at the edge of his vision, squirming and serpentine, threatening to... A hand grabbed him by the scruff of his collar, hauling him backward. He stumbled, boots flailing and slipping as he was dragged out of the circle and dumped unceremoniously in the ice beyond. He scrambled to his feet, shadows and coiling shapes still swimming in his mind. Dimly, Sigvar registered Olar standing before him, gripping his furs in one tight fist. Hala was on her knees nearby, praying frantically. The writhing shadows still moved at the corner of his eyes, and his head felt heavy, filled with stifling fog. Unwittingly, his gaze started to turn back towards the center of the ice, back toward... Olar's heavy fist struck him across his jaw, snapping his head back sharply. Don't look at it! Sigvar blinked, his head a little clearer, and he nodded. Hala, he's not strong enough, said Ola, fist poised. All the humor in his eyes was gone now, replaced with an intense, ruthless chill. He should go back. No, said Sigvar, I'm fine. He should go back, Ola repeated, looking to Hala. She finished her hurried entreaties and pushed herself to her feet, studying Sigvar with narrowed eyes. I'm fine, I can do this, he assured them both. If he falters again, kill him, said Hala. Go, check the pillars. She made her way to the next one, crunching over the ice. Don't make me do it. Ola growled at Sigvar. I don't want to have to hurl your body back out. No corpse could be left down here, for fear that it could be used to spark the growth of what dwelled below. It would be an incredibly difficult climb back out anyway. Sigvar couldn't imagine how hard it would be to have to haul a body out as well. And Olar had to bear 2 bodies out on his last couple of climbs, he reminded himself. His reverence for the old warrior was redoubled. "I will not look," vowed Sigvar, keeping his eyes locked on him. "Let's go." Olar grunted and gestured for Sigvar to take the lead. They located the rune on the next pillar almost instantly. "Here," said Olar, pointing it out. The edges of the marking were so sharp it could have been carved only an hour earlier, not thousands of years ago. That was good. It meant the ice had not melted in all that time. "This one's yours," said Olar as they approached the next mighty pillar, jutting up at an acute angle from the floor. "I'll check the next. Don't let me down, boy." Sigvar nodded as the warrior left him to survey the shard alone. It was almost completely black, and as he looked upon it, the shadows at the edge of his vision seemed to return, making it seem as though things were moving within the ice. He shook his head, walking around the pillar, eyes tracking up and down, searching for a rune, but finding none. Every angled surface was completely smooth. Frowning, he made a second pass, moving more slowly this time. Still, he found nothing. Glancing towards the other, he saw Hala and Ola had almost linked up, having checked all but the last two pillars. "Come on," he said to himself, blinking hard. "Focus." He made a third turn around the circumference. Still nothing. Hala and Ola were making their way towards him now, their expressions grim. When he looked at the pillar again, he would have sworn he saw a bead of water sliding down its side, but that was surely impossible. Narrowing his eyes, he leaned in. Up close, he could see the ice was slick with moisture. The edges of the shard were less defined than they were in the other pillars, blunted and rounded smooth. He was surprised he hadn't noticed that sooner. Still, he felt no sense of alarm, even when he saw the flicker of movement within the dark ice. An unnatural sense of calm infused his being. Dimly, he heard a shout from behind him, but it barely registered. The sound was muffled, as if it were coming from a long way away. He gave it no mind. All that matters was the blackness in the ice before him. It was calling to him, whispering to him, urging him closer. The shadows were no longer just at the periphery of his vision. Now they were all he saw. He reached out toward... A hand grabbed his own, Hala's hand. He was hurled backwards, hitting the ice almost 10 feet away. In horror, he recognized the darkness thrashing within the ice pillar, struggling to be free. It stabbed from within, straining to breach its prison. He realized it had been reaching for him. Hala's eyes were closed, one hand outstretched over the weak point in the ice where the darkness attacked. In her other hand, she clutched her talisman of Lysandra. She barked a catechism of the faith, and her outstretched hand began to glow with cold light. New ice crystals began to form upon the pillar's face. It was not going to be enough. What Hala was praying into existence was not true ice. No one had the ability to create that anymore. A spiderweb of cracks appeared upon the surface as the darkness within redoubled its attacks. With her eyes closed, Hala didn't see it, and Sigvar was too far away even as he lurched to his feet and drew his sword. Olar was suddenly at Hala's shoulder, Thunderchild clasped in both hands. Just as the darkness breached the pillar surface, spearing towards Hala with the speed of a lightning strike, Olar shouldered her aside. His warhammer smashed the tendril of darkness asunder with a deafening crack. He was not the only one, however. 3 more spat from the rupture. "Stonefist!" bellowed Sigvar. He leapt forward but was too slow. They all were. Olaf staggered back, swatting one of the tendrils aside with a sweep of Thunderchild, but was unable to stop the other 2. They thrust into his flesh with relish, one piercing the meat of his left shoulder, and the other the side of his neck, biting deep. Olar Stonefist's muscles rippled as the unearthly tentacles writhed into him. His veins turned black, starkly visible through his pale skin, and he dropped to his knees. Sigvar made to grab him, but Hala pulled him back. "No!" she shouted. "It will claim you too!" With his last strength, Olar tossed Thunderchild toward them, spinning it across the ice. "Go!" he gasped. "Get word to the Citadel. Take the hammer!" Hala yelled at Sigvar. "We can't leave him. It is too late. He is already gone." Sigvar watched in impotent horror as Olar was consumed. The Frostguard warrior was shuddering, and most of his skin was now in horrible shades of black and purple, like a bruise. More than a dozen tendrils pierced him, connecting him to the darkness within the ice. "Take the hammer, half-quiver," repeated Hala. Sigvar sheathed his blade and picked up Thunderchild, bracing for the pain. It made him gasp, the intensity of its cold flowing swiftly up his arms to his heart, almost making it stop, but he did not fight it. He embraced it, becoming one with it. A creeping shape, ridged and segmented like an insect, began to spread across Olar's flesh. It hardened like cooling volcanic rock. A sickening purple light began to pulse within him like a second heartbeat, radiating out through his flesh. In horrified disgust, Sigvar realized something was growing within Olar. With an anguished cry, Hala hurled Bloodclaw, sending the axe spinning end over end through the air. It struck Olar square between his eyes, killing him instantly. It was a merciful act, yet it saddened Sigvar to see a legend of its Frostguard meet such an ignoble end. Ice instantly formed upon Olar's corpse, extending down to where Bloodclaw was down from where Bloodclaw was embedded. Crackling hoarfrost soon encased his head, chest, and arms. The power of the true ice seemed to stall the consumption, the tendrils becoming slow and sluggish, the purple light within him dying. "Has it stopped?" hissed Sigvar. "For now, perhaps. Your axe? We leave it," said Hala, speaking swiftly. "With the blessing of the three, it will hold what dwells below in check, but there's no knowing how long. We have to go. Now." Sigvar didn't argue. He began to pick his way around the edge of the circle, but Hala stopped him. "Too slow. Across the middle. Go." Sigvar froze, unwilling to step onto the open ice, but as Hala sprinted out before him, he took a reluctant first step. Forcing his gaze to remain raised, he followed her, gingerly at first, then moving faster. At any moment he expected to feel movement below him as the immense horrific creature trapped in the ice awoke from its endless slumber. He could feel this malign force working on him, straining at his consciousness like clutching tendrils. It was watching him, that giant, lidless, unblinking eye boring into him from below. The urge to look down was overpowering. Sigvar tightened his grip on Thunderchild, gritting his teeth against the pain of its cold. He kept his gaze locked onto Hala as he breathed the litanies. Turn not from pain, for pain is life and its absence means death. Savor its caress, welcome it. Even when he stumbled, he resisted, looking down. Every step was an effort, like he was running through a snowdrift. He could feel the eye boring into him, whispering to him, calling to him. He croaked the blessings louder to drown it out. Then he was across, and he gasped for air as the pressure upon him lessened. Hala was there, urging him on. She shoved him ahead, towards the narrow defile marking their exit. Just before he slipped through, Sigvar glanced back. Did he see that purple light within the frozen corpse of Olar? He had no time to check as Hala pushed him urgently through. "Go, go," she said. There was no time for a careful, steady passage. Sigvar pressed forward, grinding against the ice, uncaring of the pain. On the other side, the two of them sprinted through the ravine, racing back to where they had descended the ice wall. "We have to alert the citadel," Hala huffed as she ran. "The Nine has been breached. The chains that hold back what dwells below have been weakened. All the other sites must be checked. The ice must be reformed." They reached their discarded climbing gear, breathing heavily. "Shouldn't we stay to fight it?" Sigvar gasped. "The Watcher will only awaken once all of the pillars are breached," said Hala. "Bloodclaw should hold back any lesser creature." "And if it doesn't, then we kill it," said Hala. "But word must reach the citadel. At least one of us has to make it back. Leave anything you don't need." With some reluctance, Sigvar slung his shield off his shoulders and propped it against the ice wall. His scabbarded sword joined it, and Hala held and strapped Thunderchild across his back. They roped themselves together, secured their ice picks, and began the long climb back to the top. All the while, he felt the great eye in the ice below, staring upward. So, this is the thing that makes this quite a good story to me, because what we have here is essentially cosmic horror, essentially more sort of into the realm of Lovecraftian horror, although I'm not super fond of calling it that, because frankly, Lovecraft was a piece of garbage person and he doesn't deserve to own the entire genre just because he wrote some of the more influential works. But what we have here is human people confronted with a power from beyond the void that is far, far beyond them in scope, that they cannot comprehend it, they cannot resist it. It is something far larger, more terrible, and completely unknowable that will consume them and use them as fuel without giving a single damn about who they are. And that is good cosmic horror. Being confronted with this unknowable, malicious evil that wants you dead for absolutely no reason except that it is hateful, and the universe is hateful, and the universe hates you, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. This works for me. It works like gangbusters. I think this is a fantastically well-written segment because it doesn't really waste any time. Like, it focuses on the action, it focuses on how the characters are relating to the horror that lies before them, how they're trying to hold on to their sanity in the face of something that eats sanity for breakfast. Anyway, let's move on. The shell that had been Olar's stone fist cracked open with a wet tear, and a pale thing spilled forth in a tumble of hissing ichor and segmented limbs. It righted itself unsteadily, clawing at the ice with talons the lengths of daggers. A slashing tail unfurled behind it and lifted its head, all bony tusks and jutting spines, revealing a burning, purple-tinged light at its heart. Sections of its spongy, flexible exoskeleton closed protectively around that heart and began to harden. It was a sickly white color devoid of hue, but its hide quickly darkened as if in reaction to the air. The creature's eyes tore open to look upon the icy world into which it had been born. 12 pinpricks of hot, purple light gathered in 3 clusters. It lifted its head high, and a keening birth scream ripped from its throat. Hala and Sigvar were halfway to the Bridge of the Lost when the inhuman cry reached them. It echoed through the fog all around them. It was impossible to tell the direction it came from or how close it was. "Climb faster," was all Hala said, and the pair increased their pace, eschewing safety for speed. Their picks hacked into the ice in a wild flurry, and they drove themselves upward with powerful kicks, toe spikes biting deep. Sigvar kept glancing down, expecting some nameless horror to emerge from the depths at any moment. And then, just as the ghost of the Bridge of the Lost appeared through the fog above, it did. "Ice in her soul," he hissed, and Hala looked down past him. "Move!" she shouted, eyes narrowing. They climbed frantically. If that thing made it to them before they reached the bridge, they'd be helpless. Sigvar glanced back once more to see the creature racing up on them. It ascended with vile, sinuous movement, multiple bladed limbs stabbing into the ice with frenzied speed. Glowing eye clusters blazed, and it screeched, the sound like steel grinding on steel, mandibles clacking. Hala made it to the bridge first. Turning, she reached down to Sigvar with her iron grip and hauled him over the edge. By the time he regained his feet, she had untied her ropes and had Bloodfang at the ready. In her other hand, Hala held one of her ice picks. It was a poor substitute for Bloodclaw, but would have to suffice. Sigvar dropped his picks and made to unsling Thunderchild from his back, but Hala stopped him. "No," she said. "Keep climbing." "I will stand with..." he began, but she cut him off with a glare. "You will climb, Half-Quiver," she said, pointing at him with Bloodfang. "No discussion." "But no discussion," she snapped. "Climb. Get word back to the Citadel." "But I should be the one who..." "Go!" she roared with such fury that Sigvar took a step back. "Go, Half-Quiver," she said quieter. "If the 3 will it, I will join you shortly." With great reluctance, he scooped up his picks and began climbing as Hala dropped to her knees in prayer, eyes closed. He was some 30 feet up the wall when the creature scuttled over the edge of the bridge. It looked up, its eyes locking onto Sigvar, and started to move in pursuit. "Here, you ugly beast," Hala called out, rising to face it. "Come to me and let me smite you down by the will of the 3. Sigvar looked on, powerless. The creature below swung its attention from him to Hala and leapt toward her with seemingly impossible speed. She rolled under its scything strike, talons sweeping through the air just inches above her. She hacked Bloodfang deep into its side as she came up, sending forth a burst of steaming entrails and eliciting a horrible screech. Then she followed up with a strike from her ice pick, but it bounced harmlessly off the beast's toughened exterior. She danced away, spinning out of range as the monster lashed out at her again. Hala struck twice more, hacking off one of the vile creature's limbs and scoring a deep wound across the side of its head, but it was unnaturally fast. As Hala's axe came back for another blow, it darted forward and stabbed one of its bladed limbs through her forearm, making her drop Bloodfang with a hiss of pain. She desperately hacked at the creature's face with her ice pick, but managed little other than putting out a few of its eyes. Her arm was still impaled. She couldn't get away. With a roar, Sigvar ripped his picks from the ice and pushed himself off. 30 feet he fell before landing, knees bent and hands outspread for balance, right beside Hala. The frozen flagstones cracked under the impact and he rolled hard, the wind driven from his lungs. He already had Thunderchild in his hands as the creature turned its attention towards him. It tried to tug its clawed limb from Hala, but she clutched onto it, keeping it trapped even as it struggled. "Strike, Half-Quiver!" Its maw opened impossibly wide, exposing rows of serrated fangs and tusks, and screamed in defiance as Sigvar brought Thunderchild around in a lethal blow. The hammer took the creature squarely in its head, half pulping it and sending it flying, with a burst of cold and crack like thunder. The hateful beast struck the balustrade of the building and tried to scramble to its feet, but staggered drunkenly, the purple light at its heart faltering. Bellowing, Sigvar charged the monster as it tried to recover. It hissed but could do nothing to avoid his next attack. This time, Thunderchild smashed it squarely in the chest, crushing its exoskeleton and sundering the protective cage around its glowing heart. As the beast sailed over the edge of the bridge, flailing wildly, that heart darkened and died. Then it was swallowed by the fog and was gone. "That was rash," said Hala. She was slumped on the ground, her wounded arm hanging loose at her side. Her skin was pale, paler than usual, and her eyes were sunken and dark. "Or perhaps it was the will of the 3, Sigvar replied, moving to her side and dropping to his knees. "Perhaps," she conceded, smiling weakly. Using a knife, Sigvar cut away the bloodied sleeve over Hala's injured arm. The flesh around the wound was dark and steaming. Blackness was already spreading into her veins. Both of them knew what could happen if that darkness were to spread any further. "Use Bloodfang," said Hala. There was no hint of fear in her voice. "Aim true," she added, tapping the center of her chest. Sigvar took up Bloodfang, gauging its weight. Ice radiated from its haft over his hands, but he barely registered. "It has not yet spread beyond your arm," he said. "It may not." Hala stared up at him, eyes clear and devoid of fear. Then she nodded. "Do it," she said. For 3 days, Sigvar climbed, and for 3 days he felt the malignant eye in the deep watching him. He felt the ravenous hunger in that gaze, gnawing at him, eating away at his resolve, but he continued on. Endure without complaint. The ice begs not for mercy nor offers it, neither shall we. While the hunger of that ancient being was palpable, Sigvar realized there was no real emotion in it. It did not feel anger or hatred or resentment at its fate. It was dispassionate, uncaring, unknowable, and patient. In a sense, that made it even more horrific. Nor was it alone. Sigvar had no idea how many other watchers were trapped down at the bottom of the howling abyss, but as he climbed, he felt other gazes turning towards him, following his progress. Finally, he pulled himself onto the Bridge of Sorrows. Only now, as he climbed from the great chasm, did he finally move beyond their gaze. Hala, ice in her soul, was roped to his back. Her eyes were closed and her breathing shallow, but she lived. Her left arm was gone below the shoulder, but there was no blood on her sleeve. The true ice core of Bloodfang had effectively sealed the wound. Bearing her had been exhausting, making the difficult climb that much harder, but such was his duty, and he had done it without complaint. Pausing only a few seconds to catch his breath, Sigvar stomped heavily across the bridge toward the citadel. It felt like he had been gone for years. The way was obscured with the billowing ice storms that he couldn't see more than a dozen yards. As the walls loomed out of the storm before him, he saw a shadowy figure awaiting him. Rakala Split-Tongue, Frostfather of the Keepers, leaned heavily upon his staff of office. Sigvar eyed the black tip of that staff as he stomped to a halt before the gate and took in the shard of ice hanging around the priest's neck. He looked upon the two of them with unease. He knew where they came from, now. "Few among your brethren have glimpsed the darkness below as we have," said the old priest. "Your understanding of the faith has deepened, but there is still much to learn." Sigvar nodded, accepting this. Split-Tongue's gaze then settled on Hala, strapped unconsciously upon Sigvar's back before shifting behind him, searching. "Stonefist?" he asked, to which Sigvar simply shook his head. He was too exhausted to say more. "From ice we are born, and to ice we return," said the Frost Priest, touching the center of his forehead in reverence. "It's melting," Sigvar managed. "One of the 9. Something emerged." "The Watchers stir," breathed the priest, eyes widening, perhaps in awe, perhaps in fear. Sigvar merely nodded, his breathing ragged. His prodigious strength was close to failing him. "Our revered mistress, the Lady of Ice and Darkness, must be informed," said the priest. The immense gates of the citadel ground open, the shadows within beckoning. "Come, Iceborn, we must prepare for what is to come." Oh boy, and at 1 hour and 17 minutes in, we finally reached the end of this marathon of a story. I can feel my throat slowly starting to get a little bit sore from all this talking, so let's talk about what this story is and what it does. It does a fantastic job of world building the threat of the void, the horror of the void. Why the void is so dangerous and so terrifying is demonstrated to us in a much more palpable way than I think it really ever has been before in any League of Legends lore. Even like the Ikathia story didn't really go into quite this much brutal detail about what the void and what the Watchers do to people when they get a hold of them. It's also interesting to hear the story setting up a few aspects of League of Legends lore going forward. The ice is melting. The Watchers are freeing themselves. They're getting loose. They're setting up a future conflict here. They're setting up a ticking clock, a threat sometime in the future that must be dealt with, presumably by Lysandra, because she's literally the only person in the world who fully understands what's going on in the Howling Abyss. That makes for some very interesting... Oops, just knocked over a bottle there. That makes for some very interesting world building in the future. Some very interesting conflict setup that I really hope that Riot are actually going to be expanding on. Like, that they're actually going to be following up on this. That they're going to be expanding on what are the Frostguard going to do? How does this change anything about their relationship to the tribes of the Avarosa and the Winter's Claw? Is Lysandra going to try and gather another alliance and sacrifice her allies once again in order to keep the Watchers at bay? What's going to happen there? Unfortunately, still, the precedence of history tells us that this will not be followed up on, at least not anytime soon. Riot in the past have been terrible, absolutely, abjectly, incredibly terrible at following up on lore developments and actually following up with lore progress for any champions, let alone even side characters within their narrative and within their world. And that is a bit of a... I'm really hoping, because they've been signaling really hard that they're ready to take their lore more seriously going forward. They've been signaling really hard that they want to do more, that they want to expand on stuff, that they want to develop on stuff. And I really hope they do, because this Sigvar is an interesting protagonist. Like, as a protagonist, he's mostly empty. Like, he's just a young man who wants to prove himself. And this is what I mean, by the way, when I said that, let's see if we can find it, that this segment here, when they reach the True Ice for the first time, that they have this little reminder of the Warhammer Thunderchild and the Twin Axes Bloodfang and Bloodclaw. This is where that little setup pays off, because Sigvar's journey, as he sets out on this quest, is that he's a young man looking to prove himself, and he's hoping one day to be worthy to carry one of these fantastical, magical True Ice weapons. And at the end of the story, he has proven himself worthy to carry one of them, but in the worst possible way. It has cost him a lot. It has cost him his innocence. It has cost him a friend and a mentor. It has cost him a father figure, probably. And it has cost him his peace of mind to become worthy to wield that weapon. And so the weapon has a thematic resonance. It's a thing that's passed on from warrior to warrior when its previous owner dies. And it's the same thing with the axes. Like, because we're reminded multiple times that there are two axes that Hala carries, when she loses one of them in order to slow down the progress of the void creature that is tearing Olar apart, that's the reason why she can't fight the void creature when it finally emerges. When she's on the bridge trying to deal with it, because she only has her other ice pick as a weapon to use, she can't fight it effectively, which is why she gets wounded. So there's setup and payoff you set this stuff up, and then when you pay off on it, it just works. Like, it makes the story flow much more smoothly. It makes everything feel earned. It makes it like when we have this issue of, oh, all of a sudden she can't use her weapon, this was set up in advance. We were told in advance that the duo of the weapons is important, and when one of them is lost, she halves her fighting power against the void creatures. So like, it all just fits together really well. Now, I've had a bunch of nitpicks, and like, most of them still apply. That pointless world building happens every once in a while, and it's kind of annoying when it does. It's not really an endemic problem with this story. Like, if you remember way the hell back when Jinx had her lore update, I spent a long time being very critical of that lore update for just doing so much fucking world building over the course of its story and not really focusing on the narrative itself, not focusing on the characters, not focusing on the action. This story addresses pretty much all of the complaints I had back then, and that's like over a year ago now, so, you know, it's hardly fair to compare them. But this story addresses all of that. It has a very strong focus on a core group of interesting, compelling characters whose struggles and trials and tribulations make sense to us as an emotional anchor. And this is the thing with fantasy, especially high concept fantasy like the Runeterra world of League of Legends, is if you don't have good characters to anchor people, your readers, in the world of League of Legends, to make them care enough about the world to give a shit about the world building, then it doesn't matter how good your story is. It doesn't matter how good the plot is. It doesn't matter how great your plot twist is. It doesn't matter how great the concept is. If there aren't good characters to ground all of this in, it's never going to work. And that's something I think this particular story understands really, really well. And something that the Syndra story, the Dreaming Pool, understands really well also, that they choose a set of characters, establish their wants, their needs, who they are as people, the changes that they might go through, and then they use those as a core, as a center, to build the rest of the stories around. And this right here is a model that, if Riot are ever going to publish novels in the League of Legends universe, a short story like this should be the model for that. A core group of characters that can bring the audience into the world, and then you can do all kinds of world building. Because, like I say, this is one of the best pieces of short fiction that Riot have released for ages. I love it. I really, truly, genuinely like this a lot. So much, in fact, that I've spent about an hour and a half talking about it at this point. And I do have my nitpicks, but because there's a good cast of characters, because there's a compelling flow of action. Like, they descend into the abyss, terrible things happen, and they are changed as people. Then they ascend up out of the abyss again, being changed people and having a new perspective on their old world. Like, as happens when Sigvar emerges from the depths and he sees the dark ice on the staff and around the neck of the priest. He gets this inkling that, that dark ice, maybe it's not such a great thing, actually. Maybe there's something kind of dark and sinister about that. And his perspective on his faith has now changed, and this leaves him open to asking questions, which is what compels you to go, I would actually like to see what happens to Sigvar next. What happens to Hala? Like, how does this adventure affect him? Does he become even more entrenched in the Iceborne, or in the Frostguard religion, which to some extent probably reveres the Void and worships it? Or does he start to question it? Does this become the wedge that drives him away from Lysandra and the Frostguard? Is this the start of the journey of a rebel, or someone who's on a journey of discovery to find out the truth about what's hidden in the Howling Abyss? Don't know, but all of these things are possible, and I would be interested in all of them. So anyway, my throat is starting to hurt, so I should probably stop talking. But if you have enjoyed this video, then so like button down below. I encourage you to click on it, especially because like this is an hour and a half of me just talking, and oh boy, that's exhausting. And it surely would be nice to have like some likes on the video in return for that, because like when a video is an hour and a half long, a lot of people are like, you know, maybe I'll be better off without that. Maybe I'll put that off until a rainy day or something like that. That's not really something I need to do right now. So, you know, a few likes to just kind of make the algorithm not bury it would surely be helpful. If you want to subscribe to the channel, I surely do appreciate that as well. And there's a bell icon that I am told I should also tell you to click upon. If you have like $1 that you don't need, that you don't mind me having, and you don't mind me spending it on buying like, good lord, throat lozenges or cough syrup or something like that, because holy shit, this was kind of rough on me, then patreon.com/CastorComics, you can donate $1 a month if you're so inclined. You get some perks in return for that, and you help me out making videos like this. And like, because like, believe it or not, there's not a huge audience in the world for hour-and-a-half long criticism videos of lore content released as promotion for video games. So, you know, sure would be nice to also be able to pay my rent from this. Anyway, if you can't support with $1 a month, and lots of people can't, that's completely okay. I don't expect it from anyone. I'm just grateful when it happens. And if you don't want to, just don't want to, that is completely okay. Also, I'm just amazed and impressed that you have watched the video this far. There's also a dislike button, and you can click on it if you want, but first you should be careful to check it carefully. You should check for any signs that the dislike button has been breached, or that there have been any physical changes to the dislike button, because if there have, then we do need to consult with a couple of priests before you touch it, because it's there's a non-zero chance that there is some kind of demonic spirit or cosmic horror sealed within it that is struggling to get out. And then once you click on it, like, obviously you're gonna unleash that cosmic horror, and like then it's gonna be too late to get the priests. Then I'm gonna have to go and find like a retired special forces operative who lives in the jungle, who is like retired because of a tragic thing that happened in his past, but he has this sort of compelling reason to go back and fight, and I have to get him, like, you have to come back into the action, the country needs you. And then he has to go into the jungle, and he has to cover himself in mud and like do the thing of, if it bleeds, we can kill it. And there's gonna be like a whole thing, and eventually the evil creature that you have unleashed is gonna like look at him and be like, wow, you're a respectable warrior, I respect you, like I totally recognize you as a great warrior. And then they're gonna have like a climactic final clash, and then one or both of them are gonna die. And if it's the warrior that I chose who died, then I'm gonna have to go and get another one, and that's gonna be like a whole thing. And like the Patreon money is just not nearly enough to support me traveling to various like deserts and jungles and sort of Arctic dog racing camps where these old warriors tend to live. It's too much trouble. It's like, just be careful when you check the dislike button before the whole thing, because otherwise I'm gonna have to go off and I'm gonna have to call the president, and good lord, I don't want to call this president about this shit, and Angela Merkel is gonna yell at me again, and that's just upsetting. Like, she's German and she's kind of scary. Anyway, thank you very much for watching.